all yours.
Thank you.
Yep.
I'm grateful for the additional time because what I want to discuss, I hope you don't mind if I remain seated.
Can you all hear down there, Ed? Yeah.
That's too bad. Why don't you come forward? For a long while, I've been very disenchanted with the stuff that I've read and listened to and watched on the topic of moral education. It's always puzzled me as to what in the world that's supposed to be. But now I can tell you that I'm nearing completion of a rather long manuscript on the topic, and I think I have answered the question as to what is it to my satisfaction. The question is whether it's of any interest to anyone else. So, I mean, what satisfied me may not satisfy anybody else, and so that's one of the reasons why I'm really delighted to have this chance. I invite your response, because there's no other way in which I can know whether what I'm doing has any value or not. 2 weeks from, or I guess 2 weeks from now, May 1st and 2nd, I'm going to be talking with a group at the University of Washington in Seattle on the same topic. They have this manuscript of some 200 pages and have been using it in a seminar. So well, anyway, what should one say about moral education? What is it? I can't go into any detail, so I'm going to skip around in various topics. What I want to suggest to you is that moral education is simply the formation of conscience. And I realize that framing of it is so simple-minded that, as I've said, virtually everybody, philosophers certainly, and surely educators, even in their most charitable moments, are likely to dismiss this as terribly archaic and useless. I mean, to say that moral education is simply the formation of conscience, everybody knows that that's an appeal to faculty psychology, long disposed of, and that conscience is really not the voice of the self, it's the voice of parents and teachers and priests and all kinds of, and that it's so corruptible. This could hardly be a useful way to approach it. And besides, to talk about moral education as a formation of conscience would, nowadays, by most people in education, would be viewed as hopelessly not only archaic, but hopelessly conservative, kind of an apology for the status quo, providing no standard of criticism, and so on. Now, all of these criticisms, that's an old-fashioned way to look at it. I would have defended myself at some time in the last 20 years. You would have heard me saying all those things I just said. Now I want to argue that none of that's true. Now, as I was mentioning to J.J. Chambliss outside here, it is a curious thing that the concept of conscience has had virtually no currency among philosophers since Descartes. I think Descartes killed it. There is a passage in John Stuart Mill in his essay on utilitarianism where he says some very interesting things, but they're so mundane, or I used to think so anyway, that you simply would dispose of it, and he doesn't dwell on it very much. It's in the section on the sanction of the principle of utility in which he says the conscience is essentially a mass of feeling that has to be broken through in order to do something, and which will subsequently result in remorse. Well, now I want to defend Mill about it. I think that's correct. That is what is essential to conscience. So, what do I want to say? I want to say that moral education is the formation of conscience. I want to say, secondly, that conscience is simply reflexive judgment. Now, this is present in Kant also, but you really have to look hard for it. Kant makes a very interesting observation that prudence reproaches, but conscience accuses. That is, he's here alluding to a judgmental kind of, prudence says to you, oh, what a fool. But conscience says to you, oh no, I mean, it's much dearer than that. Conscience is judge. Now that's an old medieval way of seeing it. One side of conscience is lawgiver, and one side of conscience is law administrator. It's reflexive judgment. Conscience is reflexive judgment. It's the judgment of the self upon the self. So that's the second proposition. The third proposition is that the formation of conscience, I want to suggest to you, is simply the acquisition of norms. So what do we get? We get these three theses. That the formation of conscience, or conscience, is reflexive judgment on particular cases. That's St. Thomas. And that inescapably involves the emotions of self-assessment. What Gabrielle Taylor has written about is the emotions of self-assessment: guilt, shame, pride, etc. We can add to those. But all of those involve our emotions of self-reflection. Those are the emotions that I want to suggest are involved in conscience. Now, from these three propositions, that conscience involves reflexivity of judgment in particular cases, and that it engages the moral emotions, I want to say there are three consequent claims. And now let me suggest roughly to you two of the significant claims. Is it follows from this that moral education is not engaged in the formation of belief, and that it's not a case of moral reasoning, of acquiring the skill of moral reasoning. That we're not talking about belief, and we're not talking about practice in moral reasoning. Now, if that doesn't displace your sensibilities just a trifle, then I don't know what to say. Okay. Maybe that's all I need to. Maybe that's all I need to say about that. Well, no. Let me read a couple of pages from the manuscript to give you an idea. These features, particularity, reflexivity, and the associated moral emotions, we have a characterization of conscience which, if not complete, is nevertheless complete enough to allow for a rather full account of the elements of moral education. The formation of conscience, understood in this way, is a central educational task. In what follows, I want to advance certain claims about this task of formation. I intend to comment, in short, not upon conscience formed, but upon conscience being formed, not upon the rational foundations of what judgments conscience may or may not deliver, but how those judgments come to be shaped and how they come to take up residence in conscience. The first and most basic claim is that the formation of conscience can be described as the acquisition of norms. process that for convenience I shall refer to as normation. The second claim is that normation, that is the formation of conscience, contrary to what Aquinas seems to hold, is not a special instance of the acquisition of knowledge. My meaning here is analogous to what Aristotle intends when he suggests that friendship, though not a virtue, nevertheless implies the possession of virtue. It's not a virtue because it's a relation, and because virtues are not relations. And friendship, however, implies the possession of virtue because in its paramount form it is a relation among persons that presumes a rough equality of virtue, and because the exercise of virtue requires the exercise of practical judgment, which exercise in turn requires a kind of knowledge. That's a pretty long path before you get to the function of knowledge. There's only that kind of distant connection between the acquisition of norms and knowledge, learning, or coming to believe. But it remains nonetheless the central business of moral education. It follows that such education cannot be understood primarily as a matter of inculcating or stimulating right belief or even right reason. Moreover, because of the intimate conceptual connection between, now get this, the intimate conceptual connection between teaching and between learning and coming to know, it remains problematic in what sense, if any, we can speak of normation as the aim of teaching, or even of learning, even though there remains no question at all that it is a central task, perhaps the very core of education. It is admittedly odd that anything so central to education should have so little strong and direct connection to knowing, to learning, to teaching, or to coming to know. Well, if that doesn't, again, I say, if that doesn't dislocate the conventions, I don't know what would. Now, let me go on then, and I want to spend the majority of my time on the notion of what I call normation. That is, it becomes obvious here that the central topic is what do we mean by norm acquisition? And in order to do that, I need to establish certain distinctions. I need to distinguish, first of all, between compliance, obedience, and observance. Between compliance, obedience, and observance. These are three different relationships to a norm. Then, secondly, I want to take an example and show you what I think are the criteria for saying of someone else that that person has acquired a norm. And then thirdly, I want to unwrap that criteria, and we'll find ourselves in the midst of, I think, a very different perspective on moral education. So what do I mean by a norm? A social norm. A social norm is what I'm speaking of. This is a term that is really abysmally understood among sociologists, and I think as a result of that, not very well understood among philosophers either. I do not refer to simply the done thing. A social norm is not simply the modal tendency of behavior within some social group, which is the usual interpretation. On the contrary, we may take it as a kind of paradigm that a social norm is a rule of conduct, not the formulation of a modal pattern of behavior. It does not describe how persons behave, rather it prescribes how they think they ought to behave or should behave. It's not merely a statement of what people do. It's a rule formulating what they think they ought to do. Social norms are therefore paradigmatically rules of ought and should. If persons within some social group conduct themselves in ways that comport with norms significant to them, then there will be observable regularities in their conduct. However, from merely observing such a regularity of behavior, we cannot infer the presence of a definite social norm as we might if social norm were a statistical concept. In other words, by norm I don't mean the norm, I don't mean the mean, I don't mean some modal concentration. Well, see this. It's easy to imagine a social group the behavior of whose members is at odds with its norms. Well, that should make the point, shouldn't it? Suppose the observable behavior of 20% accords with a long-standing situational rule of conduct, say a norm praising cooperation under certain conditions, but that the behavior of the remaining 80 regularly does not accord with the norm. We cannot infer that in such a divided social group the norm of cooperation has changed or been abandoned. The distribution tells us very little. Beyond merely observing compliance or non-compliance, we need to know, for example, whether the miscreant majority feel guilty, ashamed, or remorseful about their non-cooperation, and whether the seeming cooperative behavior among the minority is genuine or only apparent. If persons present one face for public inspection and reserve another for their private moments, if they aim to shield their conduct not alone for the sake of prudence, but to escape from shame, then in doing so they advertise the existence of a norm and testify that it governs even though its demands are ignored. The non-compliant ones, merely by their non-compliance, no more establish the absence of the norm than the compliant ones, merely by their compliance, establish its presence. So much for Roper. And if compliant behavior is insufficient to confirm the presence of a social norm, then what would be sufficient? One answer might be observant behavior. Now here are the distinctions. But already the vocabulary becomes complex, unwieldy, possibly confusing. How might observant and compliant behavior differ? Okay, we might say that behavior B accords with some norm N if N describes B. Thus to say that the behavior of the planets, their orbits, accords with the laws of motion is to say simply that those laws describe the orbits. It is not to suggest that such laws are being obeyed. Nothing resembling obedience even occurs here. The planets neither obey nor disobey. Beyond such talk of behavior that accords with the norm, as in the case of planetary orbits, there lies a vocabulary of compliance. Accord is different from compliance. One might comply with a senseless bureaucratic rule or legal edict, for example. That is to say, one might do whatever the rule directs under threat of harm, but without granting to such a rule or edict any authority whatsoever. Such compliance may be driven by threat, but it need not be. Complying with a rule might simply be the most convenient thing to do, something done merely because non-compliance, though rationally and perhaps even morally more reasonable, is nevertheless a greater nuisance than compliance. To comply with such edicts is merely to take them into account in shaping one's conduct, in the way that one takes into account the weather or an aching back. So behavior might either accord with a norm or comply with a norm. Considered as temporal and physical events, these two will be indiscernible to witnesses, but experientially they're very distinct and very different. To speak of behavior obedient to some norm is to invoke yet another vocabulary. A obeys N, or A's behavior is obedient to N only when N is viewed as legitimately commanding. Obedience, in short, is a concept that applies only when a rule or norm is prescriptive rather than descriptive, and when the behavior is compliant, but not merely compliant. Obedience requires an important addition to compliance, namely acceptance of the authority of the rule. When obedience to a norm within some social group deconstructs into mere compliance, then, as I shall try to establish soon, we have alienation. In fact, that could be a definition of anomy. Now, so beyond this progression starting with accordance, moving to compliance, and thus to obedience, there lies yet a fourth vocabulary. We all know of conduct that is not in accord with some normative rule or standard, and which therefore cannot be described as either compliant with it or obedient to it, but which at the same time is undertaken in manifest admission of the norm's authority. Think, for example, of cases in which behavior is observant of a norm but nevertheless disobedient, cases in which the authority of the norm to command is granted but the agent elects to disobey. By describing behavior as observant, in contrast to compliant or obedient, I mean to pick out just those features of conduct that display the agent's admission of the authority of a norm, leaving aside all questions of obedience or disobedience. Thus, behavior may be disobedient, yet at the same time observant of a norm. By this convention, in short, if behavior is obedient to a norm, then it is observant. But behavior observant of a norm may be either obedient or disobedient. One might, for example, lie and then feel guilty about it. Not unknown, I assume. Thus, disobeying a moral rule while at the same time acknowledging its authority. The guilt tells you that there's something there in the agent. We cannot describe such behavior as in accord with the norm or compliant with it or obedient to it, but we can describe it as observant of the rule. Behavior observant in this way but disobedient will often be concealed. In fact, the reach for concealment on the part of an actor, as I've noted already, is one thing that counts in favor, though not decisively, in favor of the view that such behavior is undertaken in observance of a norm. In short, concealment suggests that such conduct is undertaken by an agent who acknowledges the authority of the norm to command. If it be established that conduct is observant in this sense, then that would be sufficient to establish the presence of a social norm, whereas compliance or non-compliance with whatever frequency is insufficient. As an empirical matter, the demeanor of an agent, notice the demeanor of an agent acting in departure from a standard of conduct, and the response of others to that deviance will carry much more weight in establishing the operable presence of a social norm or even of a moral order. Notice that what I'm saying here, this is extremely central, as it turns out, I think, in the logic of all of this, that it is the response to error that carries the heaviest weight in determining whether or not, whether a person's behavior is in accordance or whether it's observant of a norm. That one's behavior corresponds to what a social norm would prescribe tells us really very little. Such conduct might fit any one of these four drastically different descriptions. But the response of an agent and the response of observers to departures from what the norm would prescribe tells us a great deal as to which of these descriptions is to fit. Now, given, well, you can see here, here are the rudiments then for a lengthy discussion of civil disobedience. What is civil disobedience? All of the logic is present here already in order to discuss this. I want to say it isn't really disobedience. It's civil disobedience aims at withdrawing the authority of a norm or revealing that it never had authority to begin with. Shows that people's behavior was in fact only compliance, not observance at all. All right, now let me try another approach to this. That's the first approach, based on those distinctions. Now I'm going to take the next step and ask, what are the criteria then for saying of someone else that someone else has acquired a social norm? And notice I talk about this as acquisition. It's not coming to know, and it's not belief, but there is such a thing as norm acquisition. Let's take a case as remote as possible from any moral sentiment or any moral involvement at all. Because I want to speak of the formation of conscience as involved in such things as mowing the lawn or engaging in crafts of all kinds. It's a very broad conception. And you will detect immediately in that breath that I'm also talking about what is involved in in acquiring the capacity to engage in inquiry at a high level or with excellence. So the case I take is, how would you say of someone, by what criteria could we say confidently that another person has learned to observe the rule of grammar that subject and verb should agree in person and number? I mean, that's not very morally very important, all right? But nevertheless, there's something like a norm there. Now, how would you know if someone else had acquired that? Well, one test might be that the person can state the rule on demand. Now, notice the various ways of evaluating students that are running down this list. You could say, well, a person has acquired it, observe that if they can formulate the rule on demand. But that's plainly inadequate. One's speech might have been guided by this rule long before any encounter with its formulation. In fact, that's typically the case. Being able to state the rule is neither necessary nor sufficient. One might add, is it either necessary or sufficient that one be able to identify a correct formulation of the rule in a typical paper and pencil test. Multiple choice. A second possibility would be to record the degree to which the person's speech accords with the rule as revealed in a performance of some kind. Now you've got performance testing. But this too is clearly insufficient for saying that a person is observant of the rule. One's speech might accord with it yet not be governed by it. It might accord with the rule without being observant of it. But suppose we note that A corrects his or her own speech and that of others in the face of departures from the rule. I mean, the rule is violated and someone corrects it. In that case, we will be justified in saying that the rule actually governs A's speech and that A actually applies the rule appropriately first to himself, then to others. Only under this third condition could we say that A has learned the rule as a norm, that is, has become observant of it. In short, the criterion that someone has acquired a norm, even in so simple and remote a case as a rule of grammar, is that his or her behavior accords with it, is not that his or her behavior accords with it, or that he or she can state the rule when asked, or even pick it out from a list. Learning to repeat the rule on demand, or learning that, or knowing that the words, quote, subject and verb should agree in person and number, end quote, state a rule of grammar, knowing that those words state a rule of grammar. These kinds of learning to or knowing that are not the kinds of learning or knowing that we have in mind when we think and speak of acquiring or learning norms. If there's learning or knowing at all in normation, it is certainly not learning or knowing of any of these kinds. What then is it? What kind of learning could it be? Well, the linguistic expression that comes closest to capturing the phenomena being described here as a case of learning would be some form of the expression learning to be, as in Anderson is learning to be more tolerant. That's not learning that, or learning why, or learning when, or learning what, or, you know, it's none of the usual or typical epistemological categories. Now I want to say that essential to this is also the addition of a certain critical attitude. If a person corrects his or her own speech and that of others in the face of error or irregularity, then something in addition to mere compliance or obedience is going on. This step requires the adoption of a certain critical attitude toward departures from the rule. The attitude that, in some sense, these departures are wrong, that these errors are indeed errors and are not simply artful innovations or merely optional ways of doing things. The presence of this critical attitude, apparently a part of our very criteria for saying someone has acquired a norm, is the attitude that such departures call out for correction. With this step, in other words, there is invoked the notion that the rule does more than merely state a social expectation. The rule, in the composition of the person who acquires it, must take on the status of a rule of rectitude, a statement of what is correct. Therefore, in the makeup of the learner, it must become a rule binding not only upon oneself, but upon others as well. It becomes a kind of public rule, a rule of right. Only with this additional step, only with the adoption of this critical attitude in the face of error, does the rule become the expression of an ought. Only then does it become a norm or a rule that can in any sense be said to govern. Now, with the appearance of this critical attitude, then, in other words, there emerge also the ideas of correct, incorrect, right and wrong, propriety, impropriety, social gaffe, and possibly even moral breach. An enormous range of norms and rules and departures from them is covered in that range from incorrect to moral breach. Which it will be depends on the setting and the weight attached to the norm in question. To get into a cab in Paris on one's way to the railroad station, especially in a time of civil violence, and to pronounce gare as gare, may produce embarrassment, even momentary damage to one's self-esteem, but none would count it as a moral breach. At worst, it will lead the driver to ask nervously, "Where's the battle?" Now, these notions of correct or incorrect and so forth are not produced by this critical attitude in learning. Their presence is a part of that critical attitude, not a consequence. Between the acquisition of a social norm and the adoption of this critical attitude that departures from the norm add up to error, we have not a causal, nor even a sequential, but a part-whole relation, or a structural feature of what we mean by norm acquisition. To ask how we get from the acquisition of a social norm to the adoption of this critical attitude is like asking how we get from Paris to France. We've already arrived. And not because the travel is very swift or the distance is very slight. Okay, now then another part of this, unpacking this criteria. What I've just said also entails something else, namely the acquisition. This critical attitude encompasses a kind of caring. No matter that subject and verb should agree in person and number, one would not allow the rule to be the measure of one's own speech, let alone use it as a standard by which to judge and correct the speech of others, even sotto voce, unless one cared to speak and write correctly, unless one supposed that others cared, that is, unless it matters. The reflexive announcement of the self must be that in rectitude, that rectitude matters, in craft and speech no less than in matters of morality and propriety. It matters. How are we to imagine a person who, when confronted with departures from the rule, makes corrections but does not care to be correct, or care that others are correct? Now think about it. Here's a person who corrects but doesn't care to be correct. What the hell does that mean? What would be the description of this? Now, I've struggled over that for several years. How do you describe this person? This correcting but not caring to be correct is one mark, there are others, of a kind of lethargy, kind of indolent indifference towards the rule, perhaps even toward rectitude or propriety in general. For such lassitude is the dominant feature of our relation to social norms generally, then we no longer have behavior describable as observant. Such behavior is compliant at best. Say, what the hell? Sure, I'll do it. When we imagine the absence of any such caring in the critical attitude, as I call it, then what we imagine is precisely what is meant by alienation or anomie or normlessness. In fact, that could be a definition of those terms, more adequate, I think, than any other definition I've ever found. If this attitude of correcting but not caring to be correct were extended to the whole of one's social life, then the society would assume the position of an object for manipulation, but not something to be engaged in. Without the caring aspect of that critical attitude, the view that rectitude matters, we would simply endure a kind of Kafkaesque world where conduct is prescribed, where prescriptions gain compliance, but where social norms lack any semblance of authority. legitimacy, or sense. The internal speech of the self to the self would be something like, it doesn't really matter, but this is the way they like it. I know what they want, so I'll go along with this senseless charade even though nothing vital is at stake. Such a posture of detachment is the perspective of the uninvolved and the apathetic. The key to this interior speech is found always in that indefinite, obscure, omnipresent, and distant they. How remote they always are. How senseless, yet at the same time, how pervasive are the norms of everyday life when viewed simply as the edicts that they deliver. And how thoroughly, under like circumstances, do those edicts lack even the most minute measure of moral authority. This condition is closely connected with another that the medievals described as acedia, a kind of spiritual torpor or sickness that in our own day is often expressed as ennui or boredom and banality. The ancient idea extended, however, to something more fundamental even than mere boredom. It included the notion of a certain rebellion, a condition of being asleep to life. At the same time, a resolute rejection of any possible contentment with being what one is, namely a human being. Now, so what have I said? You see all that's involved in the simple statement that moral education is norm acquisition. Well, look what that is. That means belonging to, means attachment, it means caring, it means... Now, let me shift this and say something about... This so far was about normation. And if you were to follow that completely, I would simply stop. However, the most common objection to any attempt to take norm acquisition as the standard of moral education is that, well, norms are situational. So now I want to talk about that. And then that's all, and then I'll stop. Because, no, then I'll add one more component, and that's it. Now, I've already argued in some detail that a social norm does not describe how members of a group behave. Rather, for them, it prescribes how they ought to or should behave. Moreover, such norms are always situationally specific and always subject to revision through time. That is to say, the norms or rules expressing a certain value will differ in detail from one institution to another, from one setting to another, from one time to another. For example, the norms that give shape to relations of cooperation may be more restricted in the school than in the family. Behavior called cooperative in the family and therefore endorsed will certainly be called collusion in the school, or more simply just cheating. The same behavior endorsed in one setting will be proscribed in another. This undoubted fact that norms are always situated is often construed to endorse the claim that norms are hopelessly relative to group, to situation, to time, and the like, and for that reason normation cannot provide any firm basis for moral education. In consequence of the proposition that norms are always situational, it is supposed we must give up any basis for the critical examination of norms and any rational defense for their change and improvement. This objection is really a family of objections that I've tried to gather up in one characterization. Rests, however, on a number of misconceptions, salient among which is the tendency to overlook the fact, barely stated here, that no tradition is without its critical resources, and no criticism is without its strength in some tradition. Let me say that again, because that's dynamite. There is no tradition without its critical resources, its resources for self-criticism. And there's no rational criticism that is not embedded in some tradition. this is a point that I pursue at great length elsewhere. And I'm not sure just where yet. Maybe it's in the second volume because there's another volume to this. Okay. Now we're in a position to say something about why I object to the standard treatment that moral education receives. Everyone learns some form of the dictum that situations alter things, but nobody can describe ahead of time all the situations likely to alter things in order that suitable provisions covering all contingencies can be included in the norm. Furthermore, even if such a norm of action could be framed, its complexity would exceed what anyone could learn. Fortunately, however, there's no need to introduce such complication. To have acquired the norms of home and school and their separate but overlapping norms of collusion and cooperation is already to have acquired some judgment as to how circumstances alter things. Part of what we mean, in short, when we say that norms are situationally specific is that among those things acquired in the very acquisition of norms is a developed sense of propriety, a grasp of the fittingness of conduct to setting, the developed judgment that the school is a place different from the home, and in what respects. Indeed, it's difficult to imagine just how any sense of, or judgment of propriety in such matters could be acquired except through some such process of normation. It's partly this fittingness of conduct to setting, the demand for a sense of propriety and judgment, and not the so-called relativity of the norm that we refer to by saying that the norms are situationally specific. There are really 4 points here, each crucial to the claim that moral education is education observing and elaborating the voices of conscience, and that normation is the process by which that aim is accomplished. Okay, 4 points. The first is simply to note that norm acquisition is not habit acquisition. At least not if one views habits as unthinking, fixed responses to situations. Oh, thank you. Frederick Will, whom I have only recently discovered and find to be absolutely marvelous as a philosopher, Frederick Will has noted it is a serious mistake to think of norm acquisition as a process in which persons are equipped with a repertory of fixed, unthinking modes of response. A person who is so equipped, in whom the norms of this social environment had been absorbed as if they were such modes of response, would not pass for long as a person trained in a certain discipline, occupation, or craft, or as a responsible moral agent. Indeed, such is the person whom we recognize as engaged in formula philosophy, formula writing, the person who plays the score but not the music, who cooks without imagination, who only in some Pickwickian sense can be said to know and abide by the rules of practice, but who has either forgotten or has never grasped the point, a person who quite literally and always dresses rightly as a rule. Doing things always and only by the book is all that can be expected when norm acquisition is grasped as something akin to blind conformity to or habitual compliance with social norms. Such a person may for a moment be regarded as competent in this or that activity, for a moment, but such a judgment, as Will suggests, will not be sustained. The impression of confidence will not endure simply because it is not competence that such a person displays. Paramount among things missing in this picture of such a person who plays by the book is precisely any portrayal of that fittingness of action to setting, that exercise of judgment to which we refer by pointing to the situational character of norms. Still, learning that cooperation is a good thing, yet not always, is not to learn still another rule, a kind of superordinate rule than one needs to apply, requiring then still another rule to govern the application of that one, and then still another one, and so on. Nonsense. Anyone who has learned simply that one should tell the truth in all matters, in all circumstances, and undertakes to do so by the book, will soon run afoul of the norms of courtesy, for example, when bidding farewell to the host of a dull and uncongenial party. The missing element in such cases is not familiarity with some added rule of conduct, needed to referee all conflicts between the norms of honesty and those of courtesy. Candor has its place, but so does decorum. What is missing is not some defect in the norms that govern either candor or courtesy. The tendency to find some fault in this, in the norm, some fault in the norm, in this and like situations is one thing that leads to the foundationalist project in ethics. Having supposedly found a gap deemed to be implicit in the norm, some apparently unstated conditions perhaps, one is tempted to try to fill in the gap. If we yield to the temptation, then the resulting project is going to aim at making the norm complete, either by providing the presumably missing details or by offering some additional norm of a higher order. A norm of rather extraordinary juridical capacities, such as are needed to mediate any conflict, remove any uncertainty that might arise. The project presumes that such gaps are deficiencies in the norms, but the thesis here is that there are no such gaps, or that if we acknowledge them to exist, if only as an alternative description of things, they are not to be viewed as deficiencies in the norms of action, but simply as offering further evidence that one aspect of any norm is that its acquisition calls for the acquisition of judgment. To recognize such settings and such boundaries as exist in the difference between school and home is to acquire a kind of judgment that is already a part of norm acquisition. A kind of judgment already implicit in that achievement. Again, Frederick Will has put the matter directly and generally and I think eloquently. It is not, of course, that a person learns norms as fixed paths of action and learns also an independent supervening craft, namely how to judge. Rather, one learns to judge in learning how to act and being educated in norms of action, and learns to judge only in relation to patterns of action. Now, in this mention of patterns of action, there lies the third and the fourth point that I want to make about situationally specific norms. It's not merely circumstances that alter things. Norms are specific also to practices and to institutions. Recall the observation, the part of what we mean by saying norms are situationally specific is that their acquisition entails the exercise of judgment, a sense of the fittingness of conduct to setting. But this fittingness of conduct to setting is often negotiated simply by recognizing what activity it is in which we're engaged. Nothing more. Recognizing the difference between the norms of school and home is largely identical with what it means to say that this is this place. That is, just is the school or the family or the church or the office or whatever. It's pretty much identical with such things as being able to say that we are not now simply tossing the ball, but playing baseball. We are not now simply stacking stone, we are laying a drywall. This is the sense of Will's reference to patterns of action. Norm acquisition is always embedded in activities and institutions. Acquisition occurs by engaging in conduct of whatever sort is called for by those activities and institutions, and appropriate to them in ways detached from or abstracted from human action and activities. The norms of the school or college governing the activity of what we call grading papers, for example, are not simply regulations for sorting, as though this activity were on a par with sorting apples at the orchard or classifying grades of paper in the stockroom. The norms of grading papers cannot be grasped and criticized as though they're some purely ideal and airy thing that constitutes the rules of sorting and ranking, some rules of action applicable to all situations waiting only to be drawn down from the airy heights of the heavens and applied in various human situations, in this case for grading papers and that for grading apples, and in this other for rank ordering those cherry pies. It is from that setting and only in that setting that a certain activity gains its identity as what we call grading papers. That's where the norms of grading gain their sense. And so recognizing that certain modes of behavior endorsed in the home are forbidden by the norms of the school is not a recognition easily distinguishable from simply recognizing that one is engaged in the activities of the school. Involved here are the norms of membership and participation. The conscience engaged and formed in this way is the conscience of membership and participation, a voice recognizable in a large and varied assortment of memberships. Membership in a school, a church, a team, polity, profession, etc. Now, implicit also in this idea that norms are situationally specific is a fourth point, namely that behavior observant of norms is not applicative in the straightforward sense of application. Here's where I think almost every writer following Peters and others in moral education is just going off the depths. One does not learn the norms of cooperation and then apply them. Such a view of norm observance, first comes the rule, then its application, virtually never describes what is present wherever normation has been achieved. It may approach a description of some reality in those cases where norm acquisition is incomplete, but underway. It is there amid the struggles of acquisition, after all, that the standards and rules of conduct are most likely to become not simply guides to conduct or presumptions of rectitude, but the objects of discussion. That's when you discuss the rules, when you're in a new situation. What does practice say about this situation, we might ask? In the midst of learning a new craft or practice or settling into a new environment, a new job, a new place, the guidelines may need to be discussed and something like their application practiced. But this is the description of normation aborning, not the description of normation achieved. And even in this situation, this applicative view of norm-observant behavior is by no means universal. One need only recall a paradigmatic case of being observant of a rule of grammar to recognize that this applicative model of norm governance is almost never an accurate description, even in situations of learning. I'll give you an example. In a faculty workshop in reform on curricular reform that I once conducted at Antioch College, one of the participants, a teacher of biology, was very clear in describing his aim in teaching as leading his students to apply their knowledge of biology when, for example, they looked at the huge maple, which is in the center of the quad, and the richness and the interdependence of life in its surroundings. We discussed what in this context might be meant by applying knowledge. How do you apply knowledge? And readily agreed that its meaning is not at all clear. This is not the applying a coat of paint, or applying the tape rule to the floor, or applying oneself to the task at hand. I asked whether it would make any difference to his understanding of teaching were he to describe his aim instead as simply getting the students to see things biologically. That is, to see them as a biologist would. The idea that behavior observant of norms can be understood on the model of norm application is a notion about as obscure as the idea that one is applying one's knowledge of biology when one is seeing the ecology of the maple tree in the quad as a biologist would. The applicative understanding of norm observance is just terribly misleading, if not just downright absurd. So, as I suggested already, one doesn't learn the norms of cooperation and then apply them. To the question, what are you doing? One simply says, helping with the dishes, preparing dinner, or planting the beans. One does not apply the norms of cooperation. One simply comes to be cooperative. One comes to be normed. The norms operable in any setting with respect to some activity native to that setting are nearly always quite sufficiently identified by simply identifying the activity in its setting. Simply to say, I'm grading papers is already to say what norms govern my current behavior and in what institutional environment they are to be understood. To engage in such an activity is already to be governed by the norms of that activity, by its setting and its residence in whatever is the relevant institution. But this is virtually never a matter of shaping behavior in ways that the applicative image of things would have us suppose. Now, these points are integrally related. They arise from focusing attention not upon the nature of norms, but upon the nature of their acquisition. Norm acquisition cannot be understood as the acquisition of blind habit. Such acquisition entails the acquisition of judgment and a sense of propriety. It can take place only in the context of human activities and settings, and the applicative model of governance is inappropriate in trying to understand the governance of norms. These are all features of norm acquisition that become evident when we seek to explicate what sense we are to attach to the notion that norms are situationally specific. Let me just add one last thing to this. There's this long section here. I want to make good on the other promise I made, namely that this is not a view which is subject to the criticism that you're just advocating the continuation of social affairs as they are. Not at all. In order to do this, I draw between what I've just read to you and the discussion I'm wanting to have right now. There's a long section on Durkheim and Tönnies on the distinction between Gemeinschaft and Gesellschaft in the case of Tönnies, and on the difference between normative community and the empirical community in the case of Durkheim. Now I want to just simply offer to you the payoff of those two large chunks on Tönnies, and that is, there are relations, even in the most secular surroundings, of which strong normation is an essential feature. Well, forget about that. I'll start somewhere else. The regularity of conduct within a human community, that is, the actual modal behavior that occurs there, the presence of which might be confirmed by an external observer, almost certainly will differ from the behavior that would be discoverable there if the community were all that the members think that it ought to be. That is to say, among the norms of any community there will be some that proscribe behavior, norms whose violation will therefore produce guilt or shame or some kind of evasion. It is in their response to violations of such norms that members of the community reveal their acquired sense of what the ideal embodiment of the community would look like. What the community is, in fact, that is, what is empirically found there, is almost never what members of the community think it would be if it were all that they think it ought to be. Hence, the normative and the empirical communities need to be distinguished. But please notice, and that distinction is empirically observable in the behavior of its members. This is what Simmel was talking about. Secrecy is very important. What things do people require secrecy for? And you'll know an awful lot about the norms. What is it that makes a community fall apart? And you'll know a great deal about what is it that they cannot discuss. You know an awful lot about the norms. Being naturalized to the normative community, not to the actual. That is, putting on its standards as one's second nature is what normation in the strong sense is about. Whereas acquiring the norms of the empirical community without the normative is what mere compliance is about. As I pointed out already, this latter form of normation, that producing mere compliance, is the form that converts the norms of any community into something like technical directives, rules of thumb. Instead of describing the conditions under which ideals are realized, such rules then describe only how things work, how the world operates, and thus what one needs to grasp in order to get along. For illustration, one need only consider the fact that any person for whom honesty is the best policy, that is, a person who views the standards of rules of honesty merely as an aid in getting along. I mean, if you think honesty is the best policy, if that's what you think about honesty, then you are viewing the norms and rules of honesty as simply guides to getting along. Such a person ought not to be trusted. If there be a personality type corresponding to this strictly instrumental conversion of norms, it might be the person who is said to know the price of everything and the value of nothing. in some contrast like this between the normative and the empirical communities is to be found the proper parent, perhaps, to 1,000 dualities that lie within the limits of many, many traditions. One thinks, for example, of the heavenly city and the earthly city, the city of God and the city of man, heaven and earth, value and fact, the garden and the fall, being in the world but not of it. All of these are expressions of what everybody in their right mind will recognize, namely that we are normed not to the empirical community, but the empirical community is dependent upon our normation being normed to something else. Nothing of any importance depends upon the question whether this distinction is one that Durkheim devised. It is instructive, however, to observe that he did deploy it, this distinction between the empirical and the normative. When in the rules, Durkheim speaks of social facts, the facts he has in mind are just such norms as I have described in the full sense of the prescriptive rules of a social group expressed in observant behavior. Thus, the social facts of suicide are not the tabulated data, but the norms reflected in those data. The norms are those social facts that he describes in rules as being as objective and implacable as any facts of nature. It's also this view of social facts as norms that allows us to mark a crucial distinction between the empirical community and the normative community, between the way things are and can be discovered to be and the way things would be were they all that the shared norms of a society suggest they ought to be. In this sense, the norms of a society are its ideals, not its empirical mores. Normation, thus, for Durkheim, provides the standards against which the actual community is to be assessed by its members. In other words, here's the source of rational criticism, and it's implicit in the notion of to be normed in the strong sense is to be normed to those ideals. And that is the way in which rational criticism generally enters anyway. Okay, so that's the distinction between the normative and the empirical communities. Now, I'll add just one more. That this is a kind of confession of personal concern, but I'll bet you that you have the same experience. This contrast between normative and the empirical communities has its parallel in the contrast between the internal and external voices of moral interpretation. Now, when I hear a voice addressed to me from some distance saying, in effect, you know, you're not the generous or the honest or the sympathetic and sensitive person that you claim to be, then I feel the sting. That hurts. I'm charged with being false, with being insincere or inauthentic or lacking integrity. This voice has a certain moral bite to it. It gets my attention quickly. I call this the internal voice of criticism because although it always comes and must from a point away from me, namely from another person, it's always from another person like me, not from a God, not from on high, and it is a voice addressed to an internal condition of the self. It's reflexive. This addresses the conscience. It is, in short, a critical voice directed against what I am, not against what I believe. And not being addressed to belief, neither will it be quieted by a change of belief. It calls upon me not merely to think something different, but to be something different, namely to be what I claim to be. Now, there is another voice addressing me to say there's something wrong with what I claim to be. It's a different voice saying, in effect, the goods that I seek are false, that my opinions about what has worth ought to be revised, they cannot be justified, they're groundless. To this latter voice, palm upwards, I might shrug and say, so? You have your views and I have mine. I call this the external voice of criticism, because though it too comes from a distant point, it's another kind of distance, and it's another kind of point. This is a voice addressed to the need for an external foundation of moral belief. A foundation so distant, so devoid of context, that it represents what Thomas Nagel has called a view from nowhere. This is an Olympian, or if you prefer, a magisterial voice. It is a voice that demands foundations not merely in my reason, but in reason itself, or in the very nature of things. It is addressed to me because it is addressed to any reasonable person. Because it is a voice from nowhere, it purports to be a voice for anyone. And because it is a voice for anyone, it is a voice for everyone. Now, with this external voice from nowhere, my quarrel can often seem not simply academic, but as we sometimes say, merely academic. What really is the standard of duty? Is there any such? Is the rule of utility enough? Does an acceptable standard of honesty allow for no exceptions? I mean, how much line is acceptable? If you don't think that's, well. What about this case? Can this count as an exception? Any quarrel I might have with this external voice of criticism is likely to draw heavily on such talk of rules and principles and cases. This is the voice of the philosophic quest in its justificatory practice. It is the Olympian voice of philosophy about to embark on yet another evangelical project. But with the former, that interior voice, the struggle is serious and in no sense merely academic. This voice addresses my personal integrity, not my orthodoxy. With it, I will have to wrestle. I cannot escape it. The external is, as it were, the voice of a public bar of judgment before which my beliefs must gain approval. That's my philosophic conscience. But the other is the voice of an interior bar of judgment before which I, myself, in all my particularity, must stand, all masks aside, and seek approval. These voices now both speak of true and false, but they use these words with different meanings, and the difference is stark. The external voice speaks of truth as correspondence, and thus of falsehood as mistake or error. But the internal voice speaks of truth in the logic of coherence, the coherence of a self. And thus it speaks of truth as in, this wall is true. Not as the absence of error, but as the presence of integrity. And it speaks of error not as falsehood, but as dissembling. Totally different thing. Okay, and so, beginning with the claim that moral education is the formation of conscience, conscience is the exercise of reflexive judgment, conscience is formed in normation. We are led along these different paths, describing the place of the moral emotions in self-assessment, the intrinsic acquisition of critical judgment, as well as the placement of social criticism as a part of moral education. And ending with this now initial introduction into the various voices of conscience, which I describe as craft. When did you do a job well? Of membership, am I loyal? Of duty, what ought I to do? And of memory and imagination. That's it.
Thank you.